My father was still smiling when the room went quiet. He'd raised his glass, pointed across the ballroom, and told 200 people, "That's my daughter. She empties the trash. Here." A few of his friends laughed. I kept my eyes down and kept wiping the table. Then a chair scraped. The company's CEO, a man I hadn't seen in 19 years, set down his drinks, stood up in front of everyone, and brought his hand to his brow. "Colonel Ford," he said. My father's smile didn't fall right away. It just slowly stopped meaning anything. "Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your country and your local time in the comments right now. It always means something to me to see who's out there. Let me take you back to a few hours before that salute. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I'd been doing this job, custodial staff at the Hargrove Convention Center in Richmond, Virginia, for about 14 months. And in that time, I'd worked maybe a dozen events in that ballroom. Anniversary dinners, charity auctions, a retirement party for a federal judge that ran 3 hours over and left red wine on every tablecloth. I knew the floor plan better than I knew my own apartment. I knew which corner near the kitchen smelled like old grease no matter how much you mopped. And I knew the grandfather clock near the east entrance ticked 4 seconds slow. You notice things like that when you're the one everyone looks through. The gala that night was for a defense contractor called Meridian Group. Black tie, catered by someone expensive. The kind of event where men in tuxedos talked loudly about money they hadn't made yet. My supervisor, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia, had asked me 3 days before if I'd be willing to work the floor during the event itself, not just the setup. "Keep things tidy," she said. "Refill the water pitchers. Stay unobtrusive." I told her yes because Patricia had always been decent to me, and because the extra 4 hours on my check mattered. I didn't know my father would be there. I should have checked the guest list. Patricia would have shown it to me if I'd asked, but I hadn't asked because I'd long since learned not to cross-check my personal life against my work schedule. Those two things lived in separate rooms, and I liked it that way. I was 49 years old that October, and the quiet I'd built for myself over the past 6 years was not accidental. It was constructed, wall by wall, the way you build something you intend to last. I arrived at 4 in the afternoon. The loading dock behind the convention center smelled like diesel and wet cardboard from the day's deliveries. I changed into my uniform in the staff locker room, dark gray, with the center's logo on the chest pocket, and spent the first 2 hours on setup detail. Folding chairs, linen tablecloths, running an industrial vacuum over the carpet in long, even rows that nobody would notice until the moment someone spilled champagne and noticed the rest of the floor was clean. That's the job. You make a space hold itself together without anyone having to think about it. Around 6:30, the guests started arriving. I was near the back wall, refilling a row of water glasses, when I heard his voice. My father has a particular laugh. It's not unkind, exactly, or it doesn't start that way. It begins broad and warm, the kind of laugh that makes people in a room turn toward it without knowing why. Harold Ford has always known how to fill a space. He built a commercial real estate firm in Charlotte, North Carolina from 2 rental properties, and an inheritance he never admitted to. And he'd spent 50 years being the loudest man in any room he walked into. I love him. I want to say that clearly, because what came later that night could make it sound like I don't, and that wouldn't be true. But loving someone and understanding them are 2 different things, and I'd spent most of my adult life trying to find the distance between those 2. I heard the laugh and I turned, just slightly. The way you turn toward a sound your body recognizes before your mind catches up. He was near the entrance, shaking hands with a man in a navy blazer, and he hadn't seen me yet. I had maybe 30 seconds before he did. I didn't run. I want to be clear about that too. I was 49 years old, and I had done things in my life that made running from my father at a catering event seem, by comparison, almost funny. So I didn't run. I turned back to the water glasses, and I finished the row. He saw me around 7. I was moving a small cart of clean napkins along the east wall when I heard him say my name, Felicia, in that particular tone he reserved for surprises he didn't like. I stopped the cart and turned around. He looked good. He was 76 now and his hair had gone fully silver, but he was still straight-backed, still dressed like someone who expected to be photographed. He was wearing a charcoal tuxedo and the gold watch my mother had given him on their 30th anniversary. She'd been gone 11 years. I thought about that whenever I saw the watch. "What are you doing here?" he said. He kept his voice low, but there was an edge underneath it. "I work here," I said. "You?" He stopped, looked at the cart, looked at the uniform. His jaw moved the way it does when he's doing arithmetic in his head that he doesn't like the answer to. "You're on staff, custodial," I said. 14 months. He was quiet for a moment. An older man behind him. One of his business associates, a man named Pruitt I'd met once years ago at a Christmas dinner in Charlotte, glanced between us with the careful non-expression of someone pretending not to listen. "Felicia," my father said. "Quieter now, we've talked about this. There are opportunities." "I know," I said. "I'm happy here." That was the sentence he never knew what to do with. Happy here. It didn't fit the story he'd written for my life, the one where I'd made a series of inexplicable decisions, starting with enlisting at 22 and ending with, in his view, throwing away everything I'd earned to push a cart in a convention center. He'd offered me a position in his firm twice. I'd declined both times. Not out of stubbornness, or not entirely, but because the work I was doing now asked nothing of me that I couldn't give, and I needed that. After everything, I needed a life that was the right size. He straightened up. I could see him deciding something. "Come by table 7 later," he said. "I want you to meet some people." I should have said no. Any version of me that thought 2 steps ahead would have said no. But he said it the way he always said things, as though the outcome was already decided, as though what I wanted was a variable he hadn't factored in yet, and some old part of me, some part that was still 22 and trying to prove something, said, "Okay, that was my mistake, not working the gala, not being in the building. The mistake was that word, okay." Because 2 hours later I was standing at table 7 with a water pitcher in my hand, while my father told a group of men in tuxedos, with a smile I'd known my entire life, "This is my daughter Felicia. She's one of the cleaning crew." And he laughed. And a few of them laughed with him, and the woman to his left, someone's wife in a silver dress, smiled with her mouth in that particular way that meant she felt sorry for me, which was almost worse. I kept my face still. I'd had training for that once, in another life. I set the water pitcher down on the edge of the table and I said quietly, "Nice to meet you all," and I reached for the pitcher again. That's when I heard the chair scrape behind me. I didn't know who it was yet. I didn't know what was coming. I just heard the sound, and something in me, something that had been dormant for 6 years, something that recognized the shift in a room the way a pilot recognizes the shift in an aircraft. Something in me went still. The chair that scraped wasn't the CEO's. Not yet. It was an older man, heavyset, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym. It comes from decades of someone telling you to stand up straight and meaning it. He was at the table directly behind my father's, maybe 15 feet away, and he'd half risen from his seat the way men do when they're not sure yet whether to commit to standing or sit back down. He was looking at me. Not the way the woman in the silver dress had looked at me. Not with pity or polite discomfort, but with something more focused. The way you look at a word you almost recognize in a language you haven't spoken in years. I didn't hold his gaze. I picked up the water pitcher and moved to the next table. My father watched me go. I could feel it. Hal Ford had a particular way of watching people leave a conversation, assessing, recalibrating, and I'd learned to sense it the way you learn to sense weather. Not because it frightened me, just because it was data, and data is useful. The gala was in full swing by then. Someone had hired a jazz quartet that was setting up near the far wall, and the low, warm sound of a piano being tested drifted across the room in fragments. The ballroom smelled of gardenias and hot wax from the candelabras, and something underneath both of those, that specific, slightly metallic smell of a large air conditioning system working too hard. The chandeliers threw small pieces of light across the tablecloths. 200 people eating salmon and talking about defense contracts and third-quarter projections and whatever else people talk about at events like this. And me moving through them like furniture. Older Americans understand something about invisibility that younger people sometimes don't. There's a version of it that's painful. But there's another version, when you choose, that is its own kind of freedom. I'd chosen mine. And most nights, in that ballroom, I was fine. That night, I was less fine. Having my father 20 feet away did something to the air. I made 2 more circuits of the room before he found me again. He came up on my left side near the bar station, with Pruitt at his shoulder, and he'd acquired that particular looseness in his jaw that meant he was 2 glasses of scotch past his usual careful self. "Felicia," he said, not quietly this time. A woman nearby glanced over. "Come back to table 7. I want you to meet Hargrove." He meant the founder of the convention center, a man named Douglas Hargrove, 70-something who'd made his money in commercial development before pivoting to event spaces. My father had been trying to do business with him for years, from what I understood. "He asks good questions," my father added, which meant, "Be presentable, be useful, don't say anything that embarrasses me." I thought about Patricia. I thought about the extra 4 hours on my check. I thought about the 14 months I'd spent building a life in Richmond that asked nothing more of me than I wanted to give. "I'm working, Dad," I said. "You can work and say hello." He touched my arm just above the elbow. A guiding pressure, practiced, the kind that doesn't look like pressure from the outside. 5 minutes. And that was the thing about my father. It was never a shove. It was always 5 minutes. It was always just come, say hello, just meet this person, just let me show you off. Just stop being so unnecessarily small. He didn't think he was doing anything wrong. That was the part I'd spent years trying to make my peace with. He genuinely believed that what he was offering me was help. I went to table 7. Douglas Hargrove was a trim man with small eyes and the handshake of someone who'd decided handshakes were a performance. He looked me over once, noted the uniform, and then looked at my father with a question he didn't say out loud. My father answered it anyway. "She's on the staff here," he said. "My daughter, smart girl. Just never quite figured out what to do with herself." He said it lightly, with the half smile he used for self-deprecating humor that was never actually about himself. A few people at the table smiled. One man laughed, short, polite, like a cough. "We keep hoping she'll come work for the firm," my father added, "but she seems to prefer this." He gestured at the cart. He gestured. At the cart, I stood there for a moment. The jazz quartet had started properly now. Something slow, a standard I couldn't name, and the music moved through the room like water, filling all the low spaces. I thought about all the things I could have said. There were many. I'd had years to compose them. Instead, I said nothing. I picked up the water pitcher, and I refilled the glass nearest to me, and I smiled at Douglas Hargrove. And I said, "Nice to meet you," and I stepped back from the table. That was when I heard the voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss." It was the older man, the one who'd half risen from his seat earlier. He was standing now, fully committed to it, and up close I could see him more clearly. He was maybe 74, broad through the chest, with thick white hair cut short and a face that had spent serious time in serious weather. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him the way suits fit men who'd spent their lives in uniforms, correctly but without enthusiasm. His eyes were a pale gray-green, alert, steady. He was looking at me the same way he'd looked before, like a word in a language he almost remembered. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. Virginia accent, or near enough. "I don't mean to bother you." He paused, tilted his head just slightly, the way someone does when they're trying to resolve a face from memory. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so," I said. "You sure about that?" He wasn't aggressive. There was no challenge in it. He sounded genuinely uncertain, like a man trying to solve a puzzle that mattered to him. "I'm Gus," he said. "Gus Halloran, retired Army, 32 years." I looked at him. He looked at me. "Felicia," I said, "I work here. I know you work here." He almost smiled. "That's not what I asked you." Behind me, my father had moved back into conversation with Hargrove, and the low churn of the room continued around us. Silverware, laughter, the piano, the air conditioning. But right there, in that small pocket of the ballroom near the east wall, something had gone very still. Gus Halloran looked at my hands, then at my posture, then back at my face. "Ford," he said quietly. Not a question, just the word, my name, as if he was checking something against a list inside his own head. I didn't answer. He nodded slowly, like a man who'd just confirmed something he'd hoped was true. "Thought so," he said. And then he sat back down, calmly, and picked up his drink. And he didn't say anything else. Not yet. I finished my shift circuit and went back to the supply station near the kitchen. Patricia was there, checking something off a clipboard, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked up when I came in and immediately read something in my face that made her set the clipboard down. "You okay?" she said. "Fine," I said. "My father's here." She was quiet for a moment. Patricia had known me 14 months, which was long enough to know that I didn't talk about my family, and short enough that she'd never pushed. She handed me a fresh stack of folded napkins and said, "You want me to reassign you to the back corridor?" I thought about it. The back corridor was quiet, supply runs mostly. Nobody's father at anybody's table. "No," I said. "I'm fine." She looked at me a beat longer than necessary, then picked up her clipboard again. That was Patricia. She offered the door, and she didn't make you explain why you chose to stay. I went back out. The gala had settled into its middle hour, that stretch of any large event when the food is done and the drinking is steady, and people have stopped trying to impress each other and started just talking. The jazz quartet was playing something with a brushed drum rhythm that moved through the floor up through your feet if you stood still long enough. I didn't stand still. I kept moving, the way I'd learned to keep moving in places where stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant things I wasn't ready to think about. Gus Halloran was still at his table. I noticed him the way you notice something at the edge of your vision that isn't moving when everything else is. He wasn't talking to the people around him. He was sitting with his drink and watching the room with the patient, economical attention of a man who'd spent years in environments where watching the room was a survival skill. Once, when I passed within 10 feet of him, he looked at me, just looked. Didn't nod, didn't smile. Just tracked me for a moment and then looked away. It made me careful. I'm not proud of the fact that careful was my first instinct around a 74-year-old retired Army sergeant. But careful had kept me intact for 6 years, and I wasn't ready to give it up because an old soldier had said as my last name in a quiet voice, "The thing about building a small life is that it's not cowardice." I want to be clear on that. People over 60 understand this in a way that's hard to explain to someone younger. There comes a point where the life you can sustain matters more than the life you think you deserve. I'd had a large life. I'd had a life that filled every room it walked into, and I'd lost things inside that large life that I was never going to get back, and the only way I'd found to keep moving was to make everything smaller, quieter, more manageable. Richmond, custodial work, Patricia's clipboard, the grandfather clock near the east entrance that ticked 4 seconds slow. That was enough. That had been enough. My father didn't understand that. He'd never understand it. Hal Ford was a man built for expansion. More properties, more deals, more rooms full of people who knew his name, and a child who chose contraction looked to him like failure, like surrender, like something he'd done wrong. He found me again around 9:15. I was near the east wall with an empty cart collecting used napkins from a side table when he appeared at my shoulder with the careful deliberateness of a man who'd been thinking about what he was going to say. He was alone this time. No Pruitt, no Hargrove, just my father in his charcoal tuxedo with his gold watch and his silver hair, and the expression he wore when he was about to say something he believed was reasonable. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I stopped what I was doing. What I said earlier about you preferring this." He paused, adjusted his cufflink. "That was unkind." I looked at him. In 76 years, Harold Ford had apologized to me exactly 4 times, and I remembered each one the way you remember the specific weight of rare things. This felt different from those 4. This felt like the beginning of something else. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. Then he said, "I still don't understand it, Felicia. I want you to know that. I don't understand why you're here when you could be, Dad. I'm not criticizing, I'm just, Dad." He stopped. He looked at me. Something behind his eyes went slightly uncertain, the way it did when he ran into the edges of a conversation he'd prepared for and found they didn't match the shape of the actual thing. "I know you don't understand," I said. "That's okay." He was quiet for a moment. The Plissoll played something slow and low across the room. The chandeliers threw their small lights across the tablecloths. Someone near the bar laughed too loudly and then stopped. "Come to table 7, he said finally. "Just for a few minutes. Hargrove's leaving at 10 and I want—" He stopped. "Started again. I'd like you to be there, as my daughter, not as—" He gestured vaguely at the uniform. "Just as my daughter," and there it was. The thing underneath the apology. The apology had been real. I believed that. But it had also been a door, and on the other side of the door was the same request he always made, dressed in different clothes. "Come be visible. Come be the version of you I can explain to people." I should have said no. I know that now. I knew it then. In the way you know things you're going to ignore anyway, because some part of you is still hoping that this time will be different, that this time he'll see it, that this time the thing you've been waiting for since you were 22 years old and shipping out to Fort Rucker, Alabama, with a duffel bag and a set of orders your father called a waste. This time, maybe, he'll finally see it, I said. "Okay, 10 minutes, he smiled. That broad, warm, room-filling smile. "Good," he said. We walked to table 7 together. I left the cart by the wall. Gus Halloran watched us cross the room. I felt it without looking. That steady, patient attention, tracking me the way a man tracks something he's been waiting a long time to see clearly. When we reached table 7, my father put his hand on my shoulder and turned to the 3 men still seated there, Hargrove, Pruitt, and a man I didn't recognize in a dark suit. And he said, with that laugh, that particular laugh I'd known my entire life, "Gentlemen, this is my daughter Felicia. She's the best janitor in Richmond, Virginia." The men smiled. Pruitt chuckled, and somewhere behind me I heard a chair push back from a table, then another, then the sound of someone standing up slowly, the way a man stands when he's been waiting a long time for the right moment and has finally decided it's arrived. I didn't turn around right away. That was training. When something shifts behind you in a room, your first instinct tells you to spin toward it. Training tells you to finish what you're doing, assess the full picture, and then turn. It takes maybe 2 seconds. In the right circumstances, 2 seconds is the difference between a controlled response and a reaction you can't take back. I kept my eyes on my father's face for those 2 seconds. I watched the smile. I watched Pruitt's chuckle land and dissolve. I watched Hargrove reach for his wine glass with the mild disinterest of a man who'd heard 100 versions of this kind of joke at 100 events like this one. And then I turned. Daniel Reyes was standing. He was 39, maybe 40. I'd do the math later and come up with 41. Medium height, lean, with the particular stillness of a man who'd learned to inhabit his body carefully after a long time of it not working right. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, and there was a faint scar that ran from his left jawline down beneath his collar, the kind that doesn't disappear no matter how many years pass. I hadn't seen him since he was 22 years old and unconscious and bleeding into the red dirt of a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, and I had not known until this moment that he was the CEO of the company that owned this building. He was looking at me the way Gus Halloran had been looking at me all night, except that what was in Reyes's face wasn't uncertainty. He had known. From the moment he saw me, from whatever moment that had been early in the evening or even before, when Patricia's staff list crossed his desk, he had known exactly who I was. He brought his hand up slowly, not a wave. A salute, proper, precise, the way it's done. Right hand, 2 fingers at the brow, held. Colonel Ford, he said, his voice carried. Not because he projected it, but because the room had already begun to go quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when something is happening that isn't on the program. My father's smiles stopped working, it didn't fall. That's the thing I remember most clearly. It didn't collapse or disappear, it just stopped. Like a clock that's still showing the right time but isn't running anymore. He was looking at Reyes, then at me, then at Reyes again. The arithmetic behind his eyes was moving fast and coming up empty. "I don't," he started, Lieutenant Colonel. "Retired," I said. Quietly, not to correct him exactly, just because it was true, and the truth felt important to say out loud in that room, in that moment, in front of those men. 19 years U.S. Army, MEDEVAC pilot, 2 tours Afghanistan, 1 Iraq. Pruitt had gone very still. Hargrove set down his wineglass. Behind me, Gus Halloran's voice came across the room, unhurried and certain, the voice of a man who'd spoken into radios in burning buildings and knew how to make words land. "That's Lazarus," he said, not loudly, but clearly. The name moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water. Outward in rings. "She brought our boys home," I heard someone near the bar say, quietly. "What did he say?" And someone else closer, "Lazarus." That was her call sign. My father said my name, Felicia, just that. Just my name, in a voice I hadn't heard from him before. Not angry, not dismissive, not managing. Something smaller than all of those. Something that sounded, if I'm being honest, a little like the beginning of fear. I looked at him. I wasn't angry. That surprised me then, and it surprises me still when I think back on it. I had every right to anger, and I knew it. But what I felt standing there was something closer to exhaustion, and something else I didn't have a word for yet, a kind of stillness, like a pressure that had been building for a very long time had finally, quietly, been released. Daniels Reyes lowered his hand. He stepped around the table and came toward me, and he stopped about 2 feet away, and he said, "I've been trying to find you for 4 years. I wasn't hiding," I said. "I know," he said. "That made it harder." He put out his hand. "Not the way you shake hands at a business function. The way soldiers do it, a grip, a hold, something that means I know what you cost and I haven't forgotten." "I took it, ma'am," he said. "I owe you my life. I've known that since I was 22 years old, and I'll know it until I'm done." The room was very quiet now. The jazz quartet had stopped between songs and hadn't started the next one. The chandeliers threw their small lights across 200 people who were no longer talking about defense contracts and third-quarter projections. My father was standing at table 7 with his hand half raised as though he'd been about to say something and had lost it entirely. Gus Halloran had crossed the room. He was standing a few feet to my left, at ease, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from a man who has stood in a great many rooms and known exactly what he was worth in all of them. He looked at my father for a moment, not unkindly, but directly, the way a man looks at someone he's assessing rather than judging, and then he looked at me. "Good to finally meet you in person, Colonel," he said. "I was stationed at Bagram, 2009. I heard the radio traffic that night. Whole fob did." He paused. "Didn't think anyone was coming back from that one?" "Almost didn't," I said. "But you did." "Most of us," I said. That last word landed in the quiets and stayed there. Most of us. Gus heard it. Reyes heard it. The people closest to us heard it, and something in the air shifted slightly. A drop in temperature, a tightening, because most of us meant that not all of us had, and that was a weight I'd been carrying for 19 years, and it was the part of the story I hadn't told anyone in this room yet. My father was still standing at table 7. His face had done something I'd never seen it do before. All the architecture of it, the confidence, the readiness, the forward-leaning certainty that had defined Harold Ford for 76 years, had gone somewhere. What was left underneath was just a man, older than I sometimes remembered, standing in a room full of people who knew something about his daughter that he didn't. He looked at me. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say yet. Some things need space before they can be spoken, and this was one of them. But something had changed in that ballroom. Something that had been one shape for a very long time had just become a different shape, and there was no going back to the way it had been 20 minutes ago, and we both knew it. The jazz quartet started playing again. Something soft, slow. The room began to breathe, and somewhere in the back of my mind, behind the stillness and the exhaustion, and the thing I didn't have a word for yet, something else stirred. Something older and colder and not yet finished, because Gus had said my call sign out loud. In a room full of people connected to the defense world, and there was a man 3 tables away who had hoped, for 19 years, that the name Lazarus would never be spoken in a room he was sitting in. I hadn't seen him yet, but Daniel Reyes asked me if we could sit down. There was a small anteroom off the east corridor. One of those spaces convention centers keep for overflow guests and catering staging, with 4 chairs and a folding table and a water dispenser that hummed too loudly. Patricia appeared at my elbow at some point and said she'd cover my remaining circuits, and she said it the way she said most things, which was without fuss and without requiring me to explain anything. I thanked her. She waved it off and disappeared back into the ballroom. Rise and Gus and I sat down in that small room, and someone brought coffee that nobody drank, and for a moment none of us said anything. There's a particular silence that exists between people who've shared something extreme. Not comfortable exactly, but honest. You don't have to fill it. You just have to let it be there until it's ready to become words. Reyes spoke first. I was 22, he said. First deployment. 10th Mountain Division, Forward Operating Base Shank, Paktia Province. He turned the coffee cup in his hands without lifting it. We'd been hit 3 times in 6 days, IEDs on the main supply route, then a complex ambush on a patrol, then a mortar attack on the FOB itself. By the time the 4th hit came, we had 4 guys down, 2 of them critical. The medevac request went out, and we were told. He stopped. We were told weather and threat levels made the LZ non-viable. That we should prepare for ground evac, 40 kilometers of contested road, Gus said. Quietly, not for my benefit, he'd read the reports, I assumed, or heard the accounts. But the way people name things that should be named, right, Reyes said. We had a staff sergeant named Okafor who was bleeding out from a femoral hit. We had a private named Galvez with a traumatic brain injury. Ground evac at 40 kilometers with that kind of traffic. He shook his head. We were doing the math, and the math was bad. I knew this part. Not from Reyes's telling. I knew it from the inside, from the way it had felt on my end of the radio that night, 19 years ago, in October, in the dark. The weather that night had been what my instructor at Fort Rucker, Alabama, would have described as aggressively inadvisable. Cloud ceiling at 200 feet, visibility under half a mile. Wind shear coming off the mountains in irregular bursts that made every instrument reading a negotiation between what the aircraft knew and what the air was doing. The LZ had been assessed as non-viable by 2 crews before mine. I'd read the assessment. I'd read it twice. Then I'd listened to the radio traffic, and I'd heard the math, and I'd made a different calculation. My co-pilot thought I'd lost my mind, I said. Not bitterly. It was just true. Marcus Webb, 26 years old, from Beaufort, South Carolina, who kept a photograph of his daughter tucked under his instrument panel and called her Biscuit, because she'd been born at 3 a.m, and that's what he'd been eating when the hospital called. Marcus had looked at me when I started the pre-flight check and said quietly, Felicia, the ceiling is 200 feet. I know, I'd said. They called the LZ non-viable. I know, so what are we doing? And I'd said, because it was the only answer I had. There are 4 men down there, and the ground route is 40 kilometers of bad road, and Okafor is bleeding out. So we're going. Marcus had looked at me for a long moment. Then he'd put his helmet on and started his own pre-flight sequence, and he hadn't said another word about it, because that was Marcus. He disagreed. He'd said so. and then he'd done his job. I told this to Reyes and Gus in that small anteroom, simply, without decoration. Older people understand that the best war stories aren't told with drama. They're told the way you'd describe a commute that went wrong, because that's how they felt from the inside. Technical, sequential. One thing and then the next thing and then the next thing, and the fear is there, but it's underneath the sequence, not on top of it. The approach had taken 11 minutes. I'd flown by instrument and instinct, and the kind of prayer that isn't really prayer, so much as a very focused conversation with the laws of physics. The mountain wind had hit us twice, once at altitude, once on final descent, and the second time it had pushed us 40 feet sideways in under a second, which is the kind of thing that happens so fast your conscious mind doesn't register it until your hands have already corrected for it. We'd found the LZ by its IR strobes. I'd put the aircraft down in a space that was technically large enough and practically a conversation with luck. The crew chiefs had the litters loaded in under 3 minutes. Reyes had been one of the walking wounded, a shrapnel hit to his left neck and shoulder, the scar I'd seen tonight under his collar, and he'd helped carry Okafor to the aircraft himself, one-handed, bleeding, because that's what you do. We'd lifted off with 6 men aboard and one more than the aircraft preferred. Okafor made it, Reyes said. Galvez made it. Both of them are alive right now. Okafor runs a plumbing business in San Antonio. Galvez teaches high school history in New Mexico. He paused. I've kept track, I'm glad, I said. And I meant it. That specific, uncomplicated gladness that comes from knowing a thing you did mattered. The kind you don't need anyone to confirm. Gus was watching me. He'd been watching me the whole time I spoke, with that steady, evaluating attention, and now he said, carefully, what happened on the way back. The room went quieter. The water dispenser hummed. I looked at my hands on the table. The return flight had taken 9 minutes. We were 2 miles from Bagram when the tail rotor warning light came on. A cascade failure, mechanical. The kind that can develop during hard landings on rough terrain, the kind that gives you approximately 90 seconds to make a series of decisions that have to be right the first time. I'd called the Mayday. I'd started the emergency procedures. I'd told Marcus to prepare for auto-rotation. And then the mountain wind had come back, one final time, from a direction the instruments hadn't predicted. The aircraft had come down hard. Not a crash. I won't call it a crash because we were moving forward, and I had partial control, and I put it down rather than it going down on its own. But hard. Hard enough that the airframe had buckled on the left side. Hard enough that the cargo compartment had taken the worst of it. Hard enough that Marcus, who was 26 years old, and had a daughter named Biscuit and a photograph tucked under his instrument panel, had not walked away from it. I stopped. The water dispenser hummed. Somewhere in the ballroom beyond the corridor, the jazz quartet was playing something slow. The piano, mostly. My co-pilot didn't make it, I said. Rise closed his eyes for a moment. Gus said nothing. He just nodded. Once, the way men nod when they're acknowledging something that doesn't have a response. I'm sorry, Reyes said finally. I didn't know. The official report. He stopped. The official report said a lot of things. I looked up at him. Yes, I said. It did. The official report said that the mission had been unauthorized. That was the word they used. Unauthorized. As though I'd borrowed a vehicle without asking. As though 19 years of service, and 2 combat tours, and a distinguished flying cross had been a preamble to one bad decision made in bad weather on a bad night, and the decision was the only thing that counted. The investigation had started 3 days after the crash. I was still in the hospital at Bagram, 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, a left hand that had taken glass from the instrument panel and would never fully close into a fist again, when a JAG officer came to see me. Young, careful, with the specific neutrality of someone delivering news they've been told to deliver without editorializing. He set a folder on my hospital tray and told me that a formal inquiry had been opened into the circumstances of the October 14th MEDEVAC flight. He told me I had the right to counsel. He told me to rest. I read the folder that night. The report had been compiled by my commanding officer at the time, Colonel Raymond Whitfield, 160th Aviation Brigade. It stated that the LZ for the October 14th flight had been officially assessed as non-viable by the Flight Operations Duty Officer, and that this assessment had been transmitted to all available crews. It stated that the decision to launch had been made unilaterally, without command authorization, in direct contradiction of standing orders. It stated that the resulting hard landing and loss of co-pilot Marcus Webb were a foreseeable consequence of that unauthorized decision. It did not mention that Whitfield himself had been on the radio that night. It did not mention that I had called the operations center twice before launching, that I had spoken to a duty officer who had told me, in words I can still hear if I let myself, that the call was mine to make. It did not mention that the standing orders Whitfield cited had been verbally amended by his own deputy 3 weeks earlier, in a briefing that 12 people had attended to allow crew commanders discretion in extreme casualty situations. It did not mention any of that, because Whitfield had written it and Whitfield had reasons. I told Reyes and Gus this slowly, in the small anteroom, with the water dispenser humming and the coffee going cold. I told it the way I'd told almost nothing for 6 years, carefully checking each word before I said it. The way you check your footing on ground you haven't walked in a long time. Not because I was afraid of the words, because I'd learned what happened when you said them to the wrong people, and I was still deciding whether Reyes and Gus were the right people. They were, I knew it by the time I was halfway through. You get a sense, after enough years, for who is listening to understand, and who is listening to respond. Both of them were just listening. Whitfield had a problem, I said, not with me, specifically, with the inquiry that would have followed if the mission had been formally authorized. I paused. There were 4 men down at that LZ. The ground route was 40 kilometers of contested road. A formal authorization would have required Whitfield to explain why he hadn't acted sooner, why the first 2 crews had been told to stand down without any escalation to command, why there was no contingency for a casualty load that high. The inquiry into the mission would have become an inquiry into his decisions. And Whitfield was 6 months from a promotion board. Gus made a sound that wasn't quite a word. It was the sound a man makes when he hears something that doesn't surprise him and disgusts him anyway. He needed the decision to have been mine alone, I said. Unauthorized. Reckless. A crew commander who went off script and paid for it. I looked at my hands again. The left one, the one that wouldn't close all the way. That version of events protected him, and it had the advantage of being partly true. I did launch without a written authorization. I did make the call alone. The parts that were missing just happened to be the parts that explained why. You fought it, Reyes said. Not a question. I tried, I said. For 8 months I tried. I had the testimony of the duty officer, a lieutenant named Carver, who was willing to go on record about the call. I had 3 witnesses from the pre-mission briefing who remembered the amended standing orders. I had my own flight logs and radio records. I stopped. Whitfield had rank, connections, and a promotion board that needed to stay on schedule. By the time the inquiry concluded, Carver had been reassigned to a post in Germany. 2 of my witnesses had been quietly encouraged to reconsider their recollections. The amended orders were described in the final report as informal, non-binding guidance that did not constitute command authorization. The room was very quiet. They cleared Whitfield, Gus said. They closed the inquiry without prejudice, I said, which is a different thing from clearing him legally, but in practice, yes. They closed it, and he made his promotion board, and he retired 4 years later as a full colonel with a commendation. I picked up the coffee cup I hadn't touched and set it back down. I resigned my commission 14 months after the crash. I packed a bag, drove to Richmond, and applied for a custodial position at the Hargrove Convention Center. And I have been here ever since. Reyes was looking at the table. Something in his jaw had gone tight. I should have known, he said. When I took over as CEO here, I should have reviewed the staff roster more carefully, and I should have found you, and I should have. You didn't owe me anything, I said. I owe you everything, he said. That's not the same as owing you a debt I can calculate. It means I should have been paying attention. He looked up. Whitfield is here tonight. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I kept my face still. I'd known it. In the way you know things you've been trying not to look at directly. I'd felt it when Gus said my call sign aloud, that cold stirring in the back of my mind, that old instinct that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with awareness. Someone in that ballroom had heard the name Lazarus and understood exactly what it meant. I know, I said. He's here as a consultant. Reyes said. Meridian Group brought him in 6 months ago. Defense Procurement Advisory. His voice was careful and controlled, the voice of a man managing something he feels strongly about. I didn't know his history with you when they brought him on. I found out 2 months ago when I started trying to locate you. What did you do when you found out? Gus asked. He was looking at Reyes steadily. I started building a file, Reyes said, quietly, carefully. Carver, the lieutenant, the duty officer. He's a major now, still active. I found him. He's willing to talk, he paused. 2 of the 3 witnesses from the briefing have since amended their statements voluntarily on the record, with a JAG contact I trust. Another pause. I've been waiting for the right moment. I looked at him for a long time. And the right moment is tonight, I said. The right moment, he said, was the moment you walked back into a room where Raymond Whitfield was sitting 3 tables away from you. And Gus said your call sign out loud. And 200 people in the defense and government contracting world heard it. He looked at me with the calm, certain expression of a man who'd spent 19 years thinking about this. He knows you're here now. He can't unknow it. And the longer he sits in that ballroom with what he knows, the worse his options get. I sat with that for a moment. The water dispenser hummed. In the ballroom beyond the corridor, the jazz quartet finished their song, and for 3 full seconds there was no sound at all. Then the applause started. We went back into the ballroom together. Not dramatically. Not in a line, not with purpose written all over our faces. That's not how these things work, and we all knew it. Reyes went first, alone, returning to his table near the front of the room with the unhurried ease of a CEO who'd stepped away briefly and was stepping back. Gus followed a minute later, hands in his pockets, moving at the pace of a man with nowhere to be. I waited another 2 minutes, then picked up my cart from the east wall and resumed my circuit. The room had returned to its middle-hour rhythm. People were talking again. The jazz quartet was into something up-tempo now, a little brighter than before, and the sound lifted the air in the way good live music does. Not loud enough to dominate, just present enough to soften the edges of everything. Glasses were being refilled. Someone near the bar was telling a story that kept making the people around him laugh in short, appreciative bursts. I spotted Whitfield at table 11. I'd known he was there before Reyes confirmed it. That cold stirring I'd felt when Gus said the call sign, that old awareness. Now that I was looking directly, I understood why my subconscious had registered him without my conscious mind catching up. He'd aged the way men age when they've spent their lives in controlled environments. Not badly, exactly, but with a kind of careful, managed quality like a house that's been maintained without ever being loved. He was 68 now, maybe 69, silver-haired, straight-backed, wearing a dark suit with a small lapel pin I recognized as a Retired Officers Association emblem. He was talking to the man on his left, and his face was doing what faces do when the mouth is engaged, and the eyes are somewhere else entirely. His eyes were on me, not constantly. He was too careful for that. But in the intervals between sentences, in the half-seconds when his conversational partner was speaking and his attention nominally belonged to the room, he found me, tracked me, then looked away. The way a man looks when he's calculating, not threatening, assessing distance, measuring risk, running numbers on a situation that has just become significantly more complicated than it was an hour ago. I kept moving. I want to be honest about what I felt crossing that room. There was no surge of righteousness, no cinematic certainty. What I felt was something quieter and colder and more familiar. The feeling I'd had on final approach into that LZ 19 years ago, when the cloud ceiling was 200 feet and the instruments were arguing with the air and there was no good option, only a least bad one, a kind of compression. Everything unnecessary falling away. Just the task and the variables and the next decision. He made his move at 9:47. I know the time because I was near the grandfather clock by the east entrance, the one that ticked 4 seconds slow, when I heard footsteps behind me that were neither the light quick steps of waitstaff nor the ambling drift of guests moving between conversations. These were deliberate, evenly spaced, a man walking with intention toward a specific destination. I stopped the cart and turned around. Whitfield stopped about 6 feet from me. Up close, the managed quality was more apparent. The careful grooming, the controlled posture, the expression calibrated to project something between authority and reasonableness. He'd been calibrating expressions like that his entire career. He was good at it, Miss Ford, he said. Not Colonel, not Lieutenant Colonel. Miss, the choice was deliberate, and we both knew it. Colonel Whitfield, I said. I gave him his rank, not out of deference, out of precision. I wanted him to understand that I remembered exactly who he was and exactly what he'd done, and that I was not going to be the one who flinched first. He glanced at my uniform, at the cart. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly. Not guilt, not exactly. More like a man confirming a calculation he'd already made. I heard your name mentioned earlier, he said. I wanted to say hello, a pause. It's been a long time, 19 years, I said. You look well. You look the same. Something tightened around his eyes. He adjusted his lapel pin, a small automatic gesture, the kind you make when you need a half-second to think. I heard some of what was being said at the front of the room, he said carefully. About the October flight. Another pause. I hope people aren't being given an incomplete picture of a very complicated situation. There it was. Incomplete picture. Complicated situation. The vocabulary of a man who'd spent 19 years not lying exactly, but arranging true things into shapes that served him. I'd heard these words in an official report. I'd heard them in a JAG office. I'd heard them in the specific silence that follows when an inquiry concludes and no one is held accountable, and the machinery moves on. What picture would you like people to have? I said. His jaw tightened. The accurate one, he said, which is that operational decisions in a combat environment are rarely as simple as they're made to sound in retrospect, that the inquiry was thorough and its conclusions were sound, that Marcus Webb is buried in Beaufort, South Carolina, I said, and his daughter is 20 years old now, and she grew up without her father, and the inquiry that was thorough and sound determined that the person responsible for that was me. The words landed in the space between us and stayed there. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. In the ballroom behind him, the jazz quartet played on. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed. The grandfather clock ticked its 4 seconds slow tick. I understand you're angry, he said, carefully. The tone of a man offering controlled empathy as a negotiating position. I'm not angry, I said, and I wasn't. That was the thing he hadn't calculated, that 6 years of a small, quiet life in Richmond, Virginia, had not been 6 years of suppressed rage waiting for a room like this one. I had done my grieving. I had done it in private, on my own time, and I had put it somewhere I could carry it without it carrying me. What I felt standing in front of Raymond Whitfield was not anger. It was clarity. I just want to be accurate, I said. Since you mentioned it, Felicia, he dropped the honorific entirely now. His voice went lower, more direct. The authority underneath the calibration, surfacing. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish tonight. I'm working, I said. I'm going to accomplish finishing my shift. Don't be glib. I'm not, I said. I mean it. I'm not here to accomplish anything, Colonel. I came to work a catering event. What's happened tonight isn't something I arranged. He studied me. Those careful, calculating eyes, running their numbers, Reyes, he said. Not a question. You'd have to ask him, I said. Something shifted in his face then. Not a crack, not a collapse, but a subtle internal adjustment. The look of a man who has just understood that the room he's standing in is a different shape than the room he thought he'd walked into. The exits he'd assumed were where he left them were not where he left them. The situation had geometry he hadn't mapped. He straightened up. He adjusted his lapel pin one more time. He said in a voice that had gone very flat, very controlled. This isn't over. No, I agreed. It isn't. He turned and walked back toward table 11. I watched him go, steady, straight-backed, every inch the retired colonel. He sat down. He reached for his drink. The man on his left said something to him, and he answered it. And from 10 feet away, you would not have known that anything had changed. But Gus Halloran was watching from across the room, and Reyes was watching from the front table. And I was watching from the east wall, with my cart and my uniform and my left hand that wouldn't close all the way into a fist. And in the corridor behind the kitchen, I knew, a JAG contact Reyes trusted had been sitting with a recorder and a set of documents for the past 45 minutes, waiting for exactly this moment to become the next one. The JAG contact's name was Major Denise Carver. Not lieutenant anymore. She'd made major 18 months ago, and she'd spent the 2 years before that quietly, carefully, on her own time, reconstructing what she remembered about the night of October 14th and the weeks that followed. The phone call she'd taken from the operations center, the words she'd spoken to a crew commander who'd asked if the call was hers to make, the way those words had been absent from every official document she'd subsequently been shown. She was 39 years old. She had the specific composure of someone who'd been waiting a long time to say something true in a room where it would matter, and had decided, finally, that the room was ready. Rise had positioned this carefully. I understood that now, looking back at the sequence of the evening, the way he'd placed himself at table 11's adjacent sightline, the way Gus had been seated, where he could see both the entrance and my circuit, the way the anteroom had been available, already set up with chairs and a water dispenser, as though someone had known we might need a place to sit and talk. None of it had been improvised. Reyes had been building this for months, and the Gala, Meridian Group's Gala with Whitfield in attendance as their consultant, had been the convergence point he'd been waiting for. I hadn't been part of the plan. That part was true. My presence on the custodial staff was genuine, coincidental. The kind of thing that happens in a city like Richmond when a person decides to be invisible and the world turns out to be smaller than expected. But Reyes had known I was here for 4 months, and he'd let it be, and he'd built around it, and now here we were. Major Carver came into the ballroom at 10:15. She was in civilian clothes, a dark blazer, gray slacks, and she moved through the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged there, which was helped by the fact that Reyes had added her name to the guest list 3 days prior. She went directly to Gus. They spoke for about 90 seconds. I watched from across the room as Gus listened, nodded once, and then stood up. What happened next took about 12 minutes. I've replayed it many times since, and what strikes me every time is how undramatic it was. No raised voices, no confrontation in the movie sense, no pointing fingers, no crowd gathered in a circle. Just a series of small, precise movements, like a mechanism that had been set in motion a long time ago and was finally, quietly, completing its cycle. Gus crossed to table 11. He stopped beside Whitfield's chair and said something. I was too far away to hear the words, but I saw Whitfield look up and I saw what happened to his face. That internal adjustment again, faster this time, sharper, the look of a man who has just understood that the geometry of the room has changed again, and this time there are no more exits to calculate. Gus put a hand on the back of the empty chair beside Whitfield and said something else. Whitfield looked around the room, once, quickly, taking inventory. And then he looked back at Gus, and then he stood up. They walked together to the corridor near the kitchen. Not rushed, not conspicuous. Just 2 older men stepping away from a table at a gala, the way people do when they need a quieter conversation. Reyes followed 2 minutes later. Major Carver was already in the corridor. I stayed in the ballroom. That was deliberate, and it was mine. Reyes had offered, quietly, in passing, near the bar, to have someone come get me when they were ready. I'd said no. Whatever happened in that corridor was going to happen without me performing it. I had said what I had to say to Whitfield at the east wall, and I had meant what I said. I wasn't here to accomplish anything. I was here because I'd shown up for a shift, and the world had turned out to be smaller than expected. I finished my circuit. I refilled the water glasses at tables 9 through 14. I collected used napkins and stacked them on the cart with the same even attention I brought to every other part of the job. My father found me near table 7. He'd been hovering at the edge of my circuits for the past hour. I'd been aware of him the way you're aware of weather, peripherally, without looking directly. Now he stepped into my path and stopped. And for a moment, we just looked at each other in the middle of that ballroom, with the jazz quartet playing something quiet and the chandeliers throwing their small lights and 200 people moving around us like water around 2 stones. He looked diminished. That's the only word I have for it. Not smaller physically. He was still straight-backed, still silver-haired, still wearing the charcoal tuxedo and my mother's watch. But something in the way he occupied space had changed. The forward-leaning certainty was gone. What was left was just a man, standing in a room, looking at his daughter. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was long and had many layers, and this was not the time or the place for most of them. So I gave him the part that was most true and most immediate. "Because you would have led with it," I said. "Every room we ever walked into, you would have led with it. And I needed it to be mine." He was quiet. His jaw worked the way it did when he was processing something he didn't have a ready framework for. "That's my daughter, the lieutenant colonel," he said quietly. Not proudly, not yet. More like a man trying out a sentence to see how it fits. "That's my daughter, the MEDEVAC pilot. Retired," I said. "I'm your daughter, the custodian now, Felicia." "Both things are true, Dad." I kept my voice even. Not cold, not warm, just level. I was one and now I'm the other. And neither one of them is a failure, and neither one of them is a joke. I paused. "I needed you to know that." He looked at me for a long time. The grandfather clock near the east entrance ticked its 4-second slow tick. The piano played something with a minor chord in it, something that resolved after 3 beats into something gentler. Then Harold Ford, who had been the loudest man in every room he'd walked into for 76 years, did something I had never seen him do in my life. He said, "I'm sorry, Felicia. I'm sorry for tonight, and I'm sorry for a long time before tonight." Simple. Clean. No qualifications, no buts. "No, I just want you to understand." Just the words, standing on their own. I nodded. I didn't cry. That would come later, alone, in my apartment in Richmond, with a glass of sweet tea and the window open and the sound of the city going about its business below. Right now I just nodded, and I said, "Okay, Dad," and I meant it. In the corridor near the kitchen, something was being concluded. I didn't know the details yet. I'd learn them over the following days, in pieces, as Reyes called and Gus called, and Major Carver sent a formal communication through channels I'd stopped monitoring years ago. What I knew, standing at table 7 with my father in the middle of that ballroom, was that the mechanism had completed its cycle, and the room had a different shape than it had when the evening began, and there was no going back to the way it had been. And somewhere in that shift, in the space between what had been and what was, I found something I hadn't expected to find. Not vindication, not triumph, just the particular, quiet relief of a thing that has been held for a very long time being set down, finally on solid ground. The details came in pieces, the way they always do. Reyes called me 4 days after the gala, on a Tuesday morning when I was restocking the supply closet on the 2nd floor of the convention center. I had my phone in my back pocket, and when it rang, I almost didn't answer it. Unknown number. Richmond area code. But something made me pick up. He was calm, precise, the way he'd been in the anteroom. He told me what had happened in the corridor. Whitfield had been presented with Major Carver's formal statement, countersigned and dated, along with amended statements from 2 of the 3 original briefing witnesses and a recovered radio log from the operations center that night. A log that had been archived, not destroyed, in a database that Reyes's legal team had spent 3 months locating. The log showed the timestamp of my call to the duty officer. It showed the 4-minute conversation. It showed that the call had been received and that a response had been given. Whitfield had sat with all of this for about 8 minutes, in a folding chair in a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and gardenias drifting in from the ballroom. Then he'd asked to speak with the JAG contact alone. That conversation had lasted 22 minutes. At the end of it, Whitfield had agreed to provide his own statement, voluntary, on the record, acknowledging that the October 14th mission had been conducted with the implicit authorization of the duty officer acting under his command, and that the inquiry's conclusion attributing sole responsibility to me had been, in his words, an incomplete characterization of the operational circumstances. Incomplete characterization. Even at the end, he couldn't quite say the plain word, but the statement was real. It was signed. And it was now in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. What happens next? I asked. A formal review of the inquiry findings, Reyes said. It'll take time. These things always do, but the record gets corrected. Your service record gets corrected. And Marcus Webb's family, he stopped. His daughter. She deserves to know the accurate version of what her father did that night and why. I stood in the supply closet with my hand on a shelf of folded linens, and I thought about a photograph tucked under an instrument panel. A 20-year-old woman in South Carolina who had grown up with a version of her father's death that was missing the most important parts. Yes, I said. She does. The weeks that followed were quiet ones, outwardly. I went to work. I pushed the cart. I refilled the water glasses at corporate luncheons and retirement dinners, and a wedding reception for a couple in their 70s who danced to Frank Sinatra, with the unself-conscious joy of people who have decided, at last, to stop being careful with happiness. Patricia gave me an extra shift on Fridays, and I took it. The grandfather clock by the east entrance kept ticking 4 seconds slow, and I kept not reporting it because I'd come to find it comforting, that small, reliable wrongness in an otherwise orderly room. My father called every Sunday. That was new. Before the gala, we'd spoken maybe once a month, and the conversations had the careful, slightly formal quality of 2 people who love each other and have agreed, without discussing it, to stay on topics that don't require honesty. Now he called on Sundays in the morning, and the conversations were different. Not easy, not yet, and maybe not ever entirely, but honest. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He didn't fill silences the way he used to, steamrolling them with the next thing he wanted to say. He just waited. He asked me about Marcus once, about 6 weeks after the gala. On a Sunday morning when the light was coming through my apartment window in long, flat bars, and I was sitting on the floor with my back against the couch, because that's where I always end up when I'm on the phone and thinking hard. Tell me about him, my father said. If you want to. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, Richmond was going about its Sunday business. Traffic, someone's radio, the distant sound of a church bell from the Episcopal Church 2 blocks over. He was 26, I said. He was from Beaufort, South Carolina. He called his daughter Biscuit because she was born at 3 in the morning, and that's what he'd been eating. When the hospital called, I paused. He disagreed with me that night. He said so clearly, and then he did his job anyway. I stopped. That's a particular kind of person. Not everyone is that. I've thought about it a lot. My father was quiet for a long moment. He sounds like someone worth knowing, he said. He was, I said. 2 months after the gala, my father drove up from Charlotte on a Saturday. He didn't announce it far in advance. He called Thursday evening and said he'd like to come, if that was all right, and I said yes. And on Saturday morning, he pulled up in front of my building in his silver Cadillac, looking slightly uncertain in the way of a man who has made a decision and is now committed to its consequences. We had breakfast at a diner on Broad Street, eggs and biscuits and coffee that came in a mug the size of a small bowl, and we talked for 3 hours. Not about the gala, mostly. About my mother. About his early years. The ones before the firm, the ones he'd never talked about much. A childhood in a small town in North Carolina. A father of his own who'd had his own particular gifts and his own particular failures. About the version of ambition that comes from fear and what it does to the people around you when you never examine it. He was not a man given to self-examination. That hadn't changed. But he was trying, in the deliberate, slightly clumsy way of a person picking up a skill late in life, and I found that I could make room for the trying. After breakfast, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the table between us. It was a photograph. Old, printed on the kind of matte paper they used in the early 2000s, slightly faded at the edges. It showed a young woman in flight gear, standing beside a Black Hawk helicopter on a dusty tarmac, squinting into bright suns with the expression of someone who is tired and satisfied in equal measure. She was 24 years old in the photograph. She looked like she knew exactly where she was. "I've had this since your first deployment," my father said. "Your mother sent it to me. You'd sent it to her." He paused. "I kept it in my desk. I told myself I was proud of you. Another pause. The longest one. I just never said it where you could hear it." I looked at the photograph for a long time. The woman in it looked back at me with the steady, uncomplicated certainty of someone who hasn't yet learned what the next 15 years will cost her, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not grief exactly, not regret, but something adjacent to both. The specific tenderness you feel toward a version of yourself that didn't know what was coming and went anyway. I picked up the photograph. "Thank you," I said. Outside, Richmond moved through its Saturday. The diner smelled of coffee and bacon and the particular warmth of a room full of people eating breakfast, which is one of the most uncomplicated smells in the world. A song came on the radio above the counter, something old, something my mother would have known the words to, and my father reached for his coffee and we sat there together in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, and for a little while that was enough. A year later, almost to the day, I was back in that ballroom, not working. That was the difference. Patricia had asked me about a month after the gala whether I wanted to stay on, and I'd said yes without hesitating because the reasons I'd come to Richmond hadn't changed, and the work still fit the life I'd built. But on this particular evening, I was a guest. Reyes had sent the invitation himself, handwritten on cardstock the color of cream, requesting my presence at a small private dinner for 12 people. No black tie, no jazz quartet. Just a round table in the same ballroom, stripped of its gala formality, with good food and people who had reasons to be in the same room. Gus was there. He'd driven down from Fredericksburg and arrived early and was already at the table when I came in, with a glass of sweet tea and the expression of a man who has nowhere else to be and is content about it. Major Carver was there, out of uniform, looking younger than she did in official contexts. Reyes's wife, a quiet woman named Sophia, who had the specific warmth of someone who listens more than she speaks. 2 men I didn't know initially who turned out to be Okafor and Galvez, the plumber from San Antonio and the history teacher from New Mexico, both of them alive and unhurt and sitting at a dinner table in Richmond, Virginia, 19 years after a night when that outcome had been far from guaranteed. My father was there. He came in last, slightly rumpled from the drive, and stopped in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room the way he always took in rooms, assessing, recalibrating, and then he found me, and something in his face relaxed. He sat down beside me and put his hand over mine on the table, briefly, the way he used to when I was small, and then he picked up his menu and put on his reading glasses and pretended to study it, and I let him. Okafor was a large man with a laugh that arrived before he did, warm and immediate, filling the room the way my father's laugh used to fill rooms before I understood what was underneath it. He'd driven from San Antonio with his wife, who was also large and also laughing, and they arrived carrying a pan of something that smelled like brisket and cornbread and turned out to be exactly that, because, he said, he'd heard I was from the South and he didn't show up to things empty-handed. I told him I was from Charlotte, North Carolina, which is technically the South, but not the brisket part of it. He said that was my problem, not his, and we should eat. Galvez was quieter. 38 now, with the careful, attentive manner of a man who spends his days listening to teenagers and has gotten very good at reading rooms. He shook my hand and held it for a moment and said, I teach a unit on the wars every year. I tell my students about that night. He paused. I don't use your name because I didn't know it. Now I do. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. We ate. We talked. My father, to his considerable credit, spent most of the evening listening, asking questions, waiting for answers, doing the hard work of a man trying to understand a part of his daughter's life he'd spent decades dismissing without examination. At one point, Gus told a story about a supply run gone wrong somewhere in Kuwait in 1994 that had everyone at the table laughing until Okafor's wife had to set down her fork, and my father laughed, too, genuinely. The good version of his laugh. Warm, unguarded, not performing anything. After dinner, Reyes said he had something to share. He stood, which was slightly formal for the occasion, and immediately acknowledged it by saying he'd keep it short because Sophia had made him promise not to make speeches. He said that as of the previous month, the formal review of the October 14th inquiry had concluded. The findings had been officially amended. My service record had been corrected to reflect the operational circumstances accurately, and a separate commendation, one that had been recommended and then quietly suppressed 19 years ago, had been reinstated. He didn't make it dramatic. He just said it plainly and sat back down. Gus raised his glass of sweet tea. Carver raised hers. Around the table, glasses went up, and I sat there for a moment in the middle of it, feeling something I didn't immediately have a word for, something warm and slightly unsteady. The way you feel when you put down a weight you've been carrying so long, you'd forgotten you were carrying it. I raised my glass. After dinner, while the table was clearing, Reyes came and stood beside me near the east wall. The grandfather clock ticked its 4-second slow tick, he said. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no right answer. Okay, I said. Are you happy here? I looked around the room. The round table with its aftermath of good food and used napkins and the specific comfortable disorder of a dinner that went long because no one was ready to leave. Gus arguing gently with Okafor's wife about whether San Antonio brisket was technically better than Texas Hill Country brisket, which Okafor said was the same argument and Gus said absolutely was not. My father at the far end, talking to Galvez, leaning in slightly the way he did when he was actually listening. Patricia, who'd stopped by briefly to check on the room and stayed for dessert because Okafor's wife had pressed a piece of cornbread into her hand and refused to take no for an answer. Yes, I said. I am, he nodded. He didn't push it further. That was the right response and he knew it. I've thought a lot in the year since about the call sign, about where it came from and what it meant and why I chose it. Back when I was a 27-year-old warrant officer at Fort Campbell, who'd just gotten her wings and needed something to put on the flight roster. Lazarus, the man who came back from the dead. I chose it because of the mission, MEDEVAC, the work of bringing people back from the edge of things, the specific and unglamorous labor of flying into places where life had almost run out and carrying it somewhere it could continue. That was the surface of it, the professional explanation, the one I gave when people asked. But the deeper truth, the one I understood better now than I did at 27, was that I'd always known the name meant something about me too. That there was a version of this job, of this life, that required you to go somewhere you might not come back from, and come back anyway. Changed, maybe. Carrying things you hadn't carried when you've left, But Marcus didn't come back. That's the part that will always be true, and the part I'll carry until I'm done. But he knew what the mission was when he put his helmet on, and he chose it anyway, and that choice was his, and it was real, and it was worth something. I've decided to believe that. I've decided it's the most honest thing I can do for him. The record is corrected now. The truth is in the right place. Whitfield gave his statement, and the mechanism completed its cycle, and the world moved on, the way it does. Because the world keeps moving anyway. I'm 49 years old. I push a cart in a convention center in Richmond, Virginia. I know which corner near the kitchen smells like old grease, and I know the grandfather clock by the east entrance ticks 4 seconds slow, and I know the name of every member of the custodial staff, and which of them takes their coffee black, and which of them has a kid starting school in the fall. I know that Okafor runs a plumbing business in San Antonio, and Galvez teaches history in New Mexico, and my father calls every Sunday, and the photograph from my first deployment is on my refrigerator now, held up by a magnet shaped like the state of Virginia. I know that a life can be the right size, that quiet isn't the same as small, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do in a room full of people who expect you to shrink is simply to take up the space you've already earned, and wait, and let the truth find its own level. And I know this, which I didn't understand fully until a year ago, standing at a ballroom table with a water pitcher in my hand while a CEO stood up and saluted. The name wasn't about coming back from the dead. It was about the fact that some things, some people, some truths, some long overdue reckonings refuse to stay buried. They always come back. That's not a warning. That's a promise before you go. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone in your own life who carries something quietly, someone who deserves to be seen, share it with them. Some stories find the people who need them. Maybe this one finds yours.